Historical
Makes my
Society.
old age.
My name is Helen Wilson, and I'm the membership coordinator. Michael Ehrman, our president, couldn't be here tonight, so he asked me to present the speaker. But before I do, he also asked me to give two announcements. And the first one is that this is time to renew your membership if you haven't. If you have, we thank you very, very much. If you haven't renewed your membership, or if you are thinking of joining, it's only $10 a year, and the membership forms are in the back of the room. And I would like to ask you, if you join and give us your email address, to please write your email clearly, because we can do spell check on an email address. And there's been a few cases, just a few cases, where we couldn't decipher an email, so somebody's not getting our messages. So, that was the first thing, membership. Second announcement is, a lot of people were disappointed because we had to cancel last month's meeting because of the weather, and the speaker was Brian O'Neill, who was going to talk about his book, Paris of Appalachia, Pittsburgh in the 21st Century. And that's, well, what happened was, Michael, our president, decided to take the unprecedented step of scheduling two meetings in March. Our regularly scheduled meeting on March 8th will be Dr. Resnick from CMU, Professor Emeritus of History, will talk about CMU, history of Carnegie Mellon University. But on Tuesday, March 29th, Brian O'Neill will come to speak. This is, I think, the only time we've ever had two meetings in 1 month. Yeah. So please take several flyers from the back of the room and give them to your friends so that people know that we have this extra meeting. All the meetings have been scheduled till August, so there was no other place to fit Brian in. So no openings at all, not till the new season starts in September. So anyway, mark your calendars for both March 8th and March 29th. Okay, let's see. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Patricia DeMarco is currently Director of the Rachel Carson Institute School for Sustainability and Environment at Chatham University. She's here to talk about Rachel Carson and her legacy. Time magazine called Rachel Carson one of the most influential people of the 20th century. Dr. DeMarco, until December, was Executive Director of the Rachel Carson Homestead Association. In that position, she administered and presented educational programs for the Rachel Carson Homestead. Like her, she was born in, I don't know, was Rachel Carson born right in Pittsburgh?
Come up in there, huh?
Right outside Pittsburgh, so both in western Pennsylvania. When Dr. DeMarco was growing up, her family was in the Foreign Service, so she traveled all over the world. And as we all know, traveling is a marvelous education. Dr. DeMarco graduated from the University of Pittsburgh with a bachelor of science degree in biology, and then went on to receive her doctorate in genetics, also from the University of Pittsburgh. Since then, Dr. DeMarco has done postdoctoral work at Yale and Boston University and held, sorry I'm stuttering, and held various teaching and administrative positions at Boston University, the University of Alaska, where she lived for 10 years, and then the University of Pittsburgh. In her personal life, Dr. DeMarco is interested in Oriental floral art, quilting, and modern dance. Now, we were emailing, and I love this quote you sent me, which was, "I have a fondness for the simple ways of a handmade, homemade family life." And I think that resonates with Rachel Carson. So on that note, I'd like to present our speaker, Dr. Patricia DeMarco.
Well, good evening and welcome all of you, and thank you for braving this
wonderful Pittsburgh winter weather. Hopefully we're not going to see too much more of it this year. It's my great pleasure to have a chance to share with you one of my favorite subjects. Rachel Carson has been one of my heroes the whole time I was growing up, along with Eleanor Roosevelt and Margaret Mead. So I never had the pleasure of meeting her, but she, as you have noted, was indeed known as an author and a scientist, one of the most influential thought leaders of the 20th century for her work, not only recognized in this country but worldwide. And we have people from the Japan Rachel Carson Society come every summer to Pittsburgh to honor her, and there is a Rachel Carson Center at the University of Munich in Germany, and there are many, many centers around the world where they study and follow her work. She was raised right here in Springdale, Pennsylvania. This is what Springdale looked like when she was growing up. That is their front yard. It was a wide open, rural, sort of semi-agricultural area. This is what the homestead looked like 2 summers ago, the summer of 2006. I encourage you, if you would like to have a tour of the Rachel Carson homestead later this summer. They are currently doing a renovation and upgrade of the exhibits. Schomer Zwelling, who is a very famous design architect and historian, he did the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., is advising on that project, and he's with us this week. So if you come later in the summer, you'll see the fruits of all that labor, and I encourage you to contact the Homestead Association if you would like to have a tour. And you get one free because I was here and said so. She was really a child of the Allegheny River. The area that she grew up in was 65 acres, but only 1 lot wide. And it went from the main road down, which is what now is Pittsburgh Street, and bounded on the other side by a property that was only 1 lot. These little ribbons of land were sold along the hillside. And her father bought 65 acres, expecting that it would become housing for the people who worked in Pittsburgh. That's what it is now, but it didn't happen in their lifetime. But that acreage and that sort of rural, agricultural, transforming area was the place that Rachel Carson grew up and traveled through on her growing up years. The woods and the fields were her classroom, and her mother, who was herself an educated woman, was her teacher and her friend. And she became a skilled observer as a child, and then going on into her adult life. And her mother was kind of coaching her to be a writer, and she was published at the age of 10 in the St. Nicholas magazine. She had an article, which is difficult to see, but it was based on her brother's letters home of his experiences as a pilot in the war. And he told of a friend of his who had had a battle in the clouds, the fighter pilots, and she wrote a little essay about that. And so that was published in the St. Nicholas magazine. By the time she was 14, she was an honor member, and they were paying her $10 for her articles. So she was a paid author while she was still a teenager. And if you ever have a chance to read her essay, My Favorite Recreation, which she wrote at the age of 14, describing her traveling through the wood meadows looking for the birds and following them to their nests. And she describes a whole day of activity doing that. I can't imagine a child of 14 these days trooping off with a camera, to just look at where the birds are nesting and taking a picture of the nest, you see. That was what she enjoyed doing. She was trained as a biologist, and she had her studies at Parnassus High School in 1923. She was in the graduating class, and she went on to the Pennsylvania College for Women, which became Chatham University later and is now an accredited university. She then went to Johns Hopkins University and received a Master's of Science in Zoology from Johns Hopkins University. And it's important that you remember this, because in her later life, when people were trying to discredit her and accused her of writing junk science, they forgot that she went to Johns Hopkins University, and I defy anyone to consider that junk science. She was trained as a biologist to a very high degree. Now, she did not pursue a doctorate at that time, because realize that period of time, how many of you remember the Depression years of 1929 and 32 and 33? They were difficult times. And Rachel Carson had the responsibility for providing for her family. They had given up a great deal for her education. They sold pieces of their land. Her mother sold her good china so that she could have a wardrobe to wear to college. They were not wealthy people. And I think this is another thing that people don't often think of when they think of Rachel Carson. She was not of the landed wealthy gentry, you see. They were struggling people. They were working 2 or 3 jobs. They had, she was the first one in the family besides her mother who went to university. Her sister and her brother did not. She really struggled financially. The family was not well off, but yet she became one of the thought leaders of the 20th century. So this in itself is an inspirational story, and the family held together. They pulled together, they cross-supported each other, they helped each other out. So when she had finished her master's degree, she needed to get a job. And what she did was she taught zoology at the University of Maryland for a while, and all that time she was looking for something that actually paid a living wage. I mean, they didn't pay teachers much then. I don't think they still pay teachers much most of the time. But she finally found a opportunity to go and work at the Fish and Wildlife Service. And she did go to Woods Hole Laboratory on Cape Cod the summer that she graduated from college, and then most summers thereafter. She was part of the research team. Again, very few women in that group, very few women. But she found a way to receive a position at the Fish and Wildlife Service as an aquatic biologist. She was the first woman they hired as a scientist at that time. She took the civil service exam and entered the Fish and Wildlife Service, and she stayed there until 1952. That was the scene of her most significant professional work. And she really did a tremendous amount of work at the Fish and Wildlife Service. It gave her an opportunity to study the entire Atlantic coast from Maine down to Florida and the Keys. She documented the national wildlife refuges that were established there, and she studied in a great detail and described for the public the interface between the ocean and the land. She has a tremendous amount of material in the archives, including recipes. What do you do with the catch of the week? Recipes for what you do with your fish, where you gather berries, all kinds of interesting things. And that archive is open to the public for study at the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Archives in Shepherdstown. But all of this time, she remembered her passion for writing, and many times she would submit something to her boss and they would say, Rachel, you know, this is way too elaborate for government publication, but do send it to the Atlantic Monthly. Do send it off to Reader's Digest. So she was well known as an essayist in that period of time because she would send little natural history observations out into the public press. Finally, she took pen to paper and began writing a book for real. And she did Under the Sea Wind, which is an exploration from the river areas of the upper reaches all the way down through the oceans. It was a study of the ocean from the perspective of the creatures that lived in it. And she sent it off and they published it, and nobody noticed because the war broke out and it distracted everyone and there was no attention spent on this little book. So she was very discouraged. Back she went to her typewriter in the Fish and Wildlife Service for another decade. But during that time, she was becoming very expert in the oceans and in the study of the creatures of the oceans. She was a very diligent observer and a very careful student of what was going on. And so in another 10 years, she wrote The Edge of the Sea and The Sea Around Us, as a pair of books, for first publishing The Sea Around Us, which was on the bestseller list for 18 months. And that gave her finally the financial independence to leave the Fish and Wildlife Service and become a writer for sure. So that was the launch pad for her work. And I'm telling you this partly because if you think about Rachel Carson and you hear about her, everybody thinks of Silent Spring and they think she wrote about pesticides and she was all about insects. Well, she came to that when she was already a scientist. She was already a methodical systems thinker. She was already a careful student of how the world works because she had studied the oceans for 15 years. And so when she came to Silent Spring, suddenly things began to make sense. She absolutely loved nature. This was from the time she was small until her last days. The relationship to the natural world was the key part of what made her a person. And I think any of you who spend time outdoors or go outdoors for refreshment of your soul, the cathedral of the trees or whatever it is that you find inspiring, you know how the natural world is a touchstone to what is good and wonderful. And so that was really her most defining characteristic, not only in herself, but in her writing. And she grew up in Pittsburgh in the days when they call it back in the day, but it looked like that. Now, some of you might remember those days, yes? They burned coal to heat the houses. They burned coal in the industries. They had the steamers, the ships tramping up and down the rivers. They had the trains running on coal. All of this smoke, such that in the middle of the day, you wear the brimmed hats so you don't get ashes in your face. You carry an extra shirt in your briefcase, or at least an extra collar, so every woman irons 14 shirts per man a week. You can do a shirt in 12 minutes, did you know that? And you ended up with hanging your laundry under the porch, right? Instead of out in the yard. Do you remember these things? And you put your lace curtains every week into the laundry and they came out black, right? Bleach and bleach and bleach, right? So these days, you just took it for normal that the air was like that. And Rachel Carson questioned that. She complained about it. She wrote letters, bitterly complaining about it. And she left Pittsburgh thinking the stink and the smoke, But, during that period of time, our country went into the industrial age. We were the manufacturing leader of the world. We were on top of the world. And during the period after the Second World War, there was an explosion of use of synthetic materials, plastics, things that made life more convenient, things that made life easy. And all of the munitions of war that had gone into making ammunition, that chemical production capability was turned to the production of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, because you had all of this ramped up capability. It had to be turned somewhere else. So they declared war on insects. They declared that DDT was wonderful. It was the best thing since sliced bread, according to Life magazine. And it was assumed to be safe. Crops and people alike were sprayed. And this is from the Library of Congress. Here you see people running through on the edges of the beaches where they were spraying for mosquitoes. It was advertised as advisable to prevent your children from being stung by insects while they slept, that you would spray their room with DDT to kind of keep it clean and pure. And there's the child is sleeping right there in the crib, you see, spraying right over them. And there were writings even in that time. The Federal Drug Administration in 1950 had made observations that they thought perhaps the potential health hazards had been underestimated. And the scientists were ignored. 1958, which was years before Rachel Carson's book came out, these kinds of facts were published in the Archives of Industrial Health, for example, that DDT can cause harm in small amounts. Parts per million, 3 parts per million, inhibiting heart muscle enzyme, causing necrosis of the liver, that it's stored in the fats of your organs, and therefore it was most likely to affect children and pregnant women more severely. And then they found that people who were exposed to it in an occupational capacity had even higher concentrations. Agricultural workers or insecticide plant workers had very, very high levels of DDT in their systems. And people were beginning to document this. If you have a copy of Silent Spring, you will know that in the back of her book there are 52 pages of citations to literature such as this. Now, you have to think about why she was involved with this whole thing. She was working on her 4th book about the oceans, and she was happily ensconced in her house up in Maine in the summers and going to Silver Spring in the winter, taking care of her elderly mother and her adopted son Roger, who was, this is another long story of her family life but one of her nieces had a child and the niece died, and so Rachel adopted Roger. And, you know, why did she get into this dreadful, heavy, sad book of poisons? Well, she received this letter from Olga Huffins, who was a friend of hers, and she described what had happened in her garden when the neighboring farm was sprayed with DDT. And of course, the spray doesn't stay where you put it, it drifted on the wind and it came over her land. And in the morning, she found that there were birds on her property that had died. And she pleaded with Rachel Carson, you've got to do something. You worked for these people, you can help us. Well, Rachel tried to palm off the project on several other people. She wrote to a number of colleagues and implored them to pay attention. And they said, you know, Rachel, you know, you don't want to mess with this. And, you know, she advised her colleague and her friends to go to the courts and ask for an injunction, and they did. And it included Dr. Spock and the Long Island group of people who went there. They took it to court, and in due time, the court ruled that the farmer had the right to practice crop protection, and it was within his commercial rights to protect his crops. And, you know, it was declared safe, and surely she was over, you know, exaggerating the situation. And so she went back to Rachel again, and that was where she began to start looking at Silent Spring. Now, you have to wonder why this book had so much of an effect when 52 pages worth of scientific documents had not had any impact at all on the public mind. Now, how many of you read these things, like the Industrial Archives of Industrial Health? Okay, what about the Journal of Agricultural Science? In those days, scientists did not communicate with the general public. They went to lofty academic meetings and talked to each other. They still do. But nowadays, you can have WikiLeaks leak things, you can have internet communication, you can have abstracts. There are lots of ways, and people are much more interested in exploring those kinds of things. But Rachel Carson wrote that little fable for tomorrow, those 5 pages at the beginning, where she drew people's imagination into a scene where a mythical community had so poisoned their land that one springtime no birds emerged to sing in the springtime. And it was an allegory. It was pretend this would happen. And then she went on to show it's in process as we speak right here, right now. We are doing this already to ourselves. But it was that allegory, that beautiful lyrical writing of hers that gave people a way to imagine a situation that they could not really comprehend in all of its intricate scientific detail. And if you go into the back, 4, 5, 6 chapters in, starting with the elixirs of death, if she had started there and not had that little fable at the beginning, most likely would not have had the impact that she had, because people don't relate to all of that scientific facts in the same visceral way that they do with a story that they can draw into their own association. The book was serialized in part in the New Yorker in the summer before its publication in September of 1962. And it was read by President Kennedy, it was read by Senator Lindsay of New York, Senator Ribicoff of Connecticut, and they convened several investigations to see what was going on and to find out whether there was any truth to this matter. And of course, that summer was a very great cacophony of controversy over Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. There was a $125,000 ad campaign mounted by the chemical industry trying to discredit her. Junk science, hysterical female, absolutely not correct. They fact-checked her book and all kinds of things, trying to get it not to be published. Well, of course, the more fuss they made over it, the more people wanted to read it, and the publisher said we couldn't have afforded to have that kind of an advertising. The Book of the Month Club selected it as the Book of the Month, and that was it. They were out of print 3 different times, and it had a huge reading, and it did end up having a series of congressional hearings, and she testified in the spring of 1963 before the Subcommittee on Reorganization and International Organizations, and it was regarding the coordination of activities relating to the use of pesticides. Her testimony is public information, and if you'd like a copy, you can get it from the Homestead Association. We've had it reprinted so that you can see it in its entirety. They didn't have enough copies to distribute right now, but they are reprinting. But her testimony was not a wild rant against pesticides or even insecticides. She was really quite reasonable in her requests and in her recommendations. First, that people should know what is going on. They should be informed when sprays are being done. Now, how many of you have neighbors who spray their yards for their yard gardens? How many of you? Now, when that happens, do they tell you, my garden is going to be sprayed tomorrow, you might want to keep your cat and dog inside it. Don't let your kids come over and play with my kids for 48 hours because I just had insecticide put on my yard. Okay, we're not required to do that even now, but it is something that has an effect on people when it's applied. And at that time, there was absolutely no need even to tell people that you were doing it. She also was very concerned that the doctors who were treating people who were exposed to insecticides were not familiar with the symptoms and were not familiar with the effects on people because it was kind of new. And she felt there should be more education about the effect of pesticides on health, and also how they all interrelated to each other. She was concerned about the chemical stew that we were exposed to in increasing amounts as these chemicals were introduced into our environment, into the biosphere. And also, how do they affect things that you're already taking? You're prescribed very careful doses of medicines, and then you're exposed to this unknown amount of unknown stuff on a regular basis. What happens to you? She was interested in the physiology and recommended there be more study there. This continues to be an issue that is not heavily funded. There also were no standards for the sale and use of pesticides and poisons in those days. I don't know if any of you recall the days of the flip can, where you just had it under the sink everywhere and you sprayed everything with it at all times. And you didn't think anything of it, and all it said was flip, and if you read the directions, it tells you, things like, it needs to be applied repeatedly in order to be effective, and you want to make sure you use enough, and so people think a little bit is good, more is better. There were no labels, there were no standards for what was in it. They had things like kerosene as carriers or talcum powder. There were all kinds of things that were added into the insecticide. You weren't required to tell anyone anything about any of that. There also, she felt there should be some control of the indiscriminate use. Nowadays, if you buy chemicals to put on your lawn or things that you clean with, you have that little description in 3-point type that you have to use them. I don't know which part of my glasses you can read it from, but it's there, right? That tells you in detail what is in there and the directions for using it and the restrictions against inappropriate use. None of that was in place in 1963 when she was testifying to Congress. She also had the rather outrageous concept that you don't need 25 things that are poisons. If you have one that works, why do you need all these other ones? Be selective and use it to a purpose. Kind of restrain the broad-scale application of these biocides. She also advocated biological control systems. She gave in her testimony to Congress a lengthy polemic about when you spray insecticides broad-scale from the air, you're killing the pollinators. You're killing the insects that prey on the pest insect. You're killing things that are beneficial as well as your harmful pests. Nowadays, with the proliferation of insecticide use in commercial agriculture on a large scale, there are 541 known insect pests in this country that are resistant to most biocides of all kinds. They're a huge problem. There are 541 species of biocide-resistant pests. She also was very concerned about the workers who were exposed to pesticides in the course of their occupation. At that time, there were no standards or specifications for protection of farm workers, people who worked in factories, the people whose exposure levels were recorded as very high. And she was the first person to express concern for the working people on farms. So if you go to the website for Beyond Pesticides, they're all about protecting farm workers. So after she gave her testimony, she was already close to the end of her life. She was very sick at that time. She had cancer and was being treated for arthritis for many years, and was finally given a diagnosis, had surgery and radiation therapy. So by the time she was giving her testimony in conference, she was very frail. And in the year from the end of that testimony, she only lived 1 more year. And she was invited to numerous speeches and awards and so forth. She went to a fraction of them because she was just too weak to travel. But long after, she died in 1964, the period following that was a ferment of interest in the environment, partly because of her work actuating this interest and giving voice to a kind of latent concern that had been there since the times of Gifford Pinchot under Theodore Roosevelt's domain. But the Environmental Protection Agency was established in order to begin having a special place in the government to have control over the conditions of the environment. That happened in 1970. And then the Clean Air Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act began to address the most egregious of the air and water problems. And they began to have some explicit regulations for the development of chemicals. She never said that insecticides should be banned. Okay? She is blamed for banning DDT and causing millions of people to die from malaria. Senator Coburn said that on the floor of the Senate when we were trying to get a special proclamation in honor of her centennial in 2007, and the mythology persists. But she never said that insecticides should be banned. She was concerned about their irrational and wasteful and profligate use without any thought as to what was being done. And so, page 12 of Silent Spring, that is the exact quote. And why was she effective when so many people were not? Realize she'd had years of exposure in the public as a researcher. She had documented the oceans. She understood the system. She understood how things worked. And therefore, when she saw the broadcast use of things that she knew were poisons, she felt viscerally and understood well the consequences beyond the immediate application. And she was very passionate about her work. She was persuasive because she really believed it and felt it deeply. And she was unusually eloquent in the expression of her thoughts. And therefore, she is studied as a writer as well as a scientist. Her legacy to us really is a body of work that is a tool and a touchstone for study and for reflection and for information about her time and her ways. There is a diaspora of environmental organizations all over the world that can trace their foundation back to her work, some of them explicitly to establishing her legacy. The Rachel Carson Council, the Rachel Carson Homestead Association, of course, the Environmental Defense Fund, the National Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, of which she was a member, Audubon, of which she was a member, the Nature Conservancy, of which she was a member. So there are a number of organizations, at least 300 legitimate organizations that are directly aligned to her work. And the entire process of including an explicit government attention to the environment. Now, its power waxes and wanes depending on who's in power, but there is a structure within the government that's charged with protecting the environment, and that is directly a result of her recommendations. And she also left us an environmental ethic of systems thinking and precaution against contamination that really persists as, drawn from her writing and really is relevant and applicable to today's issues. And it's a fairly simple ethic, and I like this because the praying mantis was her favorite insect. And it's very simple. First, that you try to live in harmony with nature. Try to build your life around a situation where you're not fighting nature, but you're trying to blend in harmony with it. And that you preserve and learn from the natural places of the world. There are very few natural places left in the world that have not been tampered with and shaped or improved by human activity. And you have a great deal to learn from places that have been left in a natural system. But she went beyond that kind of ethic, which is common to many ethicists, including Thoreau and John Muir. She really felt that people had a role in this, that you had to minimize the impact of man-made materials on the natural systems of the world. She was particularly concerned in her time of life about the radiation and the fallout from the atomic bomb, and also the testing of nuclear weapons, which was going on at the time that she was writing. The nuclear proliferation around the world, where there were bombs exploded for experimental purposes in the deserts. She understood that the fallout from those kinds of things would circle the globe. And she wrote, tremendous amounts of material in her speeches in her later life about that. And also the materials that you throw away. There's no away. Nothing goes away. There's no away. So she was concerned with what happens to the synthetic materials. And she also placed human people in the intricate web of life that connects all the living creatures of the earth. And she asked that we consider the implications of our actions on the global web of life. So here you see an oil refinery at night, and this is the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River and Gulf Coast, which is a result of the heavy deposits from the Mississippi Valley into the water, where it becomes saturated and you can't have enough oxygen. It's a dead zone. So these kinds of things were the sorts of evidence of human activity having an actual, measurable, tangible effect on the real world.
Is that the dead zone at the time of her life, or is that the current dead zone?
That's the current one. That was 2007 picture. It's bigger now because of the Gulf spill, because all of the dispersant and everything. There's a much greater. The photographs of the dead zone from this summer, about twice that size. I wanted to remind you of why all of these things are connected, why we are part of a web. I know you've all seen the hydrology cycle, but think about the fact that when you use chemicals on the field, okay, you're going to get some that runs off and seeps into the water, and it can get into the ground system, but you also have wind. And the wind will blow it up into the clouds, and it can transport for miles and miles. And the dust of the ground will go distances away and be deposited somewhere entirely different, and everything that was in the soil will go with it. So you have opportunities from industrial, residential, commercial, agricultural to be circulated all around the globe by the action of the wind and the water, and the water cycle as it goes both in the water system that you drink and also into the air and down through the precipitation. You also have the accumulation of toxins through the food chain. Now, you might think that the regulations or standards are saying, okay, you're discharging something into the river and it can't be any bigger than 4/100ths of a part per million. That's not very much. That's a trivial amount. How can this possibly, what do you want me to do? 4/100ths of a part per million? I mean, I can't even measure anything smaller than that. How could we possibly take it out? So we dump it into the river and everybody says, fine. But, okay, the little plankton and things in the water, the microscopic creatures that eat those, are then consumed by the smaller fish. And you see it goes up. And then the larger fish eat the smaller fish and it goes up. And then the raptors eat the fish and it goes way up. Now, if you put the human food chain in there, it gets even worse. Because we're at the top, if you're a meat eater. How many of you are vegetarians in this room? Yay, okay. So you're somewhere down here, okay, you're not in such a bad state. But if you are a carnivore, your part in the food chain can be significantly affected by things that just accumulate in little tiny amounts at the bottom. They get concentrated as they go up. And there are unintended consequences of this activity. No one intends to poison other people. We do not deliberately go about, poisoning people. We don't think about it. It goes away, right? You throw it out in the trash and it goes away. Well, we have air pollution, water pollution, and contamination of the ground with man-made chemicals throughout the system. we are still the second most polluted air city in the country, depending on whether Los Angeles is up or down, we're first or second. And part of this is because of the drift, indeed. Part of it is because we still use coal for generating power, and 4 of the most polluting power plants in the country are in western Pennsylvania today still. They were grandfathered from the Clean Air Act and they continue to run. And the chemicals accumulate in ways that you don't expect. There are 80,000 chemicals at least in common use today. Of that, fewer than 200, that's a typo, fewer than 200 have been actually tested for health effects. And they've only banned 5 under the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976. In Europe, they adopted a precaution principle where you cannot sell a chemical commercially unless it's been proven to be safe. You have to register them, and we've not adopted that approach here. So the U.S. Geological Survey monitors our water supplies nationwide. Every 2 years, they take samples from all the public reservoirs, and they look at what is in the water. And they're finding that there are tremendous amounts of materials in the water as residues. Steroids, non-prescription drugs, insect repellent, detergent metabolites, disinfectants, plasticizers, fire retardants, antibiotics, and so on and so forth. And these are statistically significant amounts of material in the finished drinking water that you find in the water supply. You also find that they are in us. This was a study by the Environmental Working Group that they did in 2007. They did a random sample of 10 newborn infants and did blood samples from the cord blood and found 227 synthetic chemicals, of which 76 were known carcinogenic or mutagenic materials. There was a big outcry, and the Centers for Disease Control was asked to repeat the study in a larger sample, which they did. And with the more sophisticated equipment, they found 441. 93% of the population has bisphenol A in their bodies. And people will say, well, nobody can prove that that's that it hurts you. We're all fine. Well, I don't know. You think about the stew, and you think about the fact that we're involuntarily exposed to things on a grand scale, and that you'll find traces of DDT in people from Auckland to the Arctic. We've managed to contaminate the entire world at this point. So you have to think about the fact that people are part of the problem. You have chemicals in your personal care products, unmetabolized pharmaceuticals go down the toilet. Sometimes things that you're finished using, you throw them down the toilet to make sure the kids don't get in them. Our water treatment system does not eliminate these kinds of compounds from the water supply. They eliminate bacteria, and they eliminate debris, and they purify it for bacterial contamination. But hydrocarbons, compound, organic compounds are not eliminated from our water treatment system at this time. And we use a lot of pesticides in this country. 25% of the pesticides used worldwide occur in our farmlands. And 98% of what is sprayed hits non-target species, and 95% is 95% of the herbicides hit non-target species. So the weed killers hit things that are not targeted as weeds, and the pesticides hit insects that are not pests. So that material goes into the water. Now, there is some evidence in the wild that was accumulated by Dr. Tyrone Hayes out of Berkeley, California. Many of you heard him speak. He's been to Pittsburgh a couple of times to speak, and he's worth hearing if you ever see him advertised. He's really quite engaging as a speaker. But he found in the wild frogs that had definitely unfrog-like appearance, multiple legs, deformities of all kinds, and he began to investigate. Now you understand the endocrine system is really the messenger system of your body. And key thing about endocrine system is that it operates at extremely low concentrations in the body. Very, very small amounts of hormone are functional. And they are very specific. You have a specific receptor and you have a specific agent of action. And when they disrupt this, there are things that mimic that specific action and receptor combination that mimic the real hormone and sometimes may block it, or it may cause it to respond too much, or at the wrong time, or in the wrong way. And so you can have many things at very small concentrations end up disrupting the endocrine functions. And there are a number of compounds which, when studied in the laboratory, are found to have endocrine disrupting effects in the body, both in experimental animals, and we don't know for sure in people because you can't do experiments on people. But if you look at the work of Dr. Linda Birnbaum at the National Institute of Environmental and Health Sciences, she's the director there. She came and spoke at the Rachel Carson Legacy Conference in 2009, and this was a slide that she used. And so these compounds are things that are in your everyday products. Bisphenol A is in the lining of most canned goods. It's used in plastics, in many other places. It's structural as a structural plastic in things like helmets and dashboards and things like that. But it's also used in soft baby bottles, children's toys. So it's a commonly used plasticizer. Phthalates and parabens you will find in personal care products. They're used as stabilizers and emollients, and you find them in the ingredients along the bottom usually. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers, fire retardant. All of your pillows, your upholstered furniture, children's clothing for sleeping in, bedding material, they put this in by law so that if you're smoking in bed, you can't ignite yourself when you're around you. And then it just became more broadcast from there. Coatings of computers and electronic devices so you can't ignite things. They're used on all kinds of things, and they're a potent endocrine disruptor. Polychlorinated biphenyls were used as insulating fluid in electrical devices. They were banned in the 70s. How many of you fish? Fish in the Allegheny River, any of you? Okay. You can only eat your fish, right? One of the reasons you don't eat your fish in the Allegheny River is that they have PCBs in them. There's still a good, healthy dose of PCBs in the sludges of that river, and they get stirred up from time to time, and the fish, of course, reflect a lovely content. You can look at the work of Dr. Conrad Volz from the Graduate School of Public Health. He did a study of the fishes of the Allegheny River in 2008, and that study documented the findings of many endocrine disruptors in fishes of the Allegheny River. Dioxin and the heavy metals, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, and lead are generally byproducts of the combustion of coal. They come out in the smoke and end up in the water or in the ground as the smoke settles. And pesticides and herbicides were talked about. People did not intend that these things have consequences. In the 1950s, many women took diester stilbestrol as a way of preventing morning sickness and as trying to help you have an easy pregnancy. It was thought to prevent miscarriages, and many women took it, because it was recommended for that purpose. Turns out that their children of those women often have fertility problems, high frequency of endometriosis, high frequency of sterility, and difficulty in conceiving children, in their children, mother's children. So you don't always know immediately, and you don't intend evil, but these things were not thought through. And atrazine is one of these. It is a fungicide put on fields for helping the germination of corn. And most cornfields have atrazine applied to the fields so the weeds don't germinate, and the corn does. And you will find in the areas where the dust from those fields has come down, Tyrone Hayes studied the frogs in the spring, and he found both male and female cells in those frogs. This is definitely not normal. Frogs are not normally hermaphrodites. So even in the wild, and this was replicated in the lab and followed a dose response curve, and is definitely one of the things. Atrazine is illegal in Europe. It is made in Europe. Its largest market is here. And we have not addressed these kinds of things where we have known issues. we are operating in a sense of denial. We pretend that the problem isn't there. And it is endemic in the way we address problems like this. It's complicated, it's diffuse, you can't really figure out who to blame, you can't draw a dose-response effect in people that you can say, aha, this did that, therefore prosecute X. Can't do that with this sort of thing. It's everywhere. It's around us because of how we use things. So denial of the problem is one approach. Another approach is, let's design the hazards out of the system. Most of our laws figure out how much exposure is okay, that 0.04 parts per million that you're allowed to put into the water. And they say, okay, if you titrate it down to that bit, we think you're okay, it's pretty much safe. But these things don't break down. They accumulate, they just recirculate, and their metabolites sometimes are worse in the beginning. So what they break down to is also dangerous or toxic. So over time, they accumulate in the biosphere and they just keep circulating around, causing chaos. You can take the approach of, instead of trying to titrate the exposure, to design the hazard out of the process or the product, and that's called green chemistry. Eliminate the hazard rather than the exposure. So, for example, if you have insecticide issues, if you have pest problems in your fields, find a non-toxic way to deal with it. Use some kind of control mechanism that does not involve poisoning yourself and your children. Now you can go over to the Phipps Conservatory, I know all of you know where the Phipps Conservatory is, and you will see times when they have signs up there and say spraying. What they're doing is they take high velocity sprays of water and they literally spray the bugs off of the plants, collect them in little dishes at the bottom and destroy them in ways that do not cause, boil them for example, or do something that causes them to be inactive and off of the plants that does not cause residues of damaging materials to accumulate in the biosphere or in their greenhouse, for example. There are lots of ways of doing this. And if we go back to, again, the handmade, homemade, old-fashioned ways. I grew up in Pittsburgh, in Mount Washington, at the bottom of Lily Street on Southern Avenue. There's whole rows of little houses, 2 or 3 family houses. We lived upstairs, my grandparents lived downstairs, and we had a 1/4-acre backyard, as did everybody else on the block. And except for 2 houses owned by Mr. Stang and Mr. Shaw, we were all from the same community in Italy, and they all grew vegetables and fruit trees and illegal chickens under the porch. And we never used any pesticides because you couldn't afford them, okay? You were assigned on Japanese beetle patrol, you know. You get a little jar of olive oil and you collect all the Japanese beetles off of the grapes. And you did that every morning and you did that every afternoon before you came in from, you know, whatever you were doing. And we had all kinds of competitions, who could catch the most and so on. So after a little while there weren't so many, you know. And all the kids in the neighborhood did that every day for weeks. The next year there were hardly any out there. The same thing, you have mechanisms for doing things in a way that nourish back the soil, that don't require toxic materials. And you say, well, good heavens, organic farming, yes indeed. You have a little plot in your backyard, a 1/4-acre farm. Excuse me, the entire country of Brazil has declared organic practice as the law of their culture on a commercial scale. And they are not having any problem selling their products. They're not having any trouble producing commercially viable quantities of materials from their agricultural undertaking. So, you know, you have to think about the long-term effect of what it is that you're doing and eliminate the hazards by design. We're smart, you know. Apply your mind to the problem, get rid of the difficulty. You can make clean air choices all around you. You know, don't smoke. Okay. Conserve energy. The old adage, if everyone replaced 4 light bulbs with energy efficient bulbs, you could close 39,000 megawatt power plants. Okay, now the law has said by 2012 there will be no more incandescent light bulbs sold, they're all gonna be fluorescent. I'm waiting to see the list of which 39 power plants they're gonna close. So you can yourself pledge to have a pesticide-free environment in your own undertakings with your interface with the land. You can choose local and organic foods. We're very fortunate in Western Pennsylvania, there are enough agricultural establishments within 100 miles of Pittsburgh that you can actually be sustained as a population here within 100 miles of a supply. And there are not a lot of places that can say that. You can choose personal care products that don't poison you and your children. Go to safecosmetics.org, go to the environmentalworkinggroup.org, EWG.org. You can find what you use, take an inventory of what's in your cupboard and under your sink, and determine which ones are okay and which ones are better choices. They will list them in rank order, and you can just move closer to the non-toxic end of the spectrum. Now, you may find that your favorite perfume is up there somewhere on 5 or 6. So you have to decide. Read the labels. Get your magnifying glass, keep it in your purse. I know for those of you who are like me, can't read 3-point type. This stuff was written by the lawyers for the other lawyers, okay? There are lawyers in the room. But they do have a considerable amount of useful information if you take the time. And once you do it and figure out a set of favored things, you don't need to read the label every time you go to the store. Do it, one category at a time. Okay, I'm going to look at the laundry washing equipment and look at all of those and do, every time you shop, take a different one and do a comparison. And then once you select the ones that you like, you don't need to go through it every time you go shopping. You never get out of the store. But it can be fun. I went through the experience of trying to find cream, for your coffee that had cream. Not that 2-inch list of I'm not sure what it is. So I'm standing there in the giant bowl, and I'm taking down one jar at a time, reading this, and I'm looking through my glasses and putting it back, and I'm moving down the shelf, and pretty soon I have 5 or 6 people watching me, and I'm reading. I finally called the manager over there who was stocking the shelves, and they said, "Where's the cream?" And he says, "Well, there's a whole shelf of cream." I started reading the contents. Carrageenan, Polybars. This isn't cream. Don't you sell something that just has cream in it? Or cream and milk? Well, he didn't that particular day. It was kind of interesting because a couple of other people started looking at it too. It can be a troublemaker, but it's fun. You can compost your garbage. They make all kinds of nifty contraptions these days if you don't want to have just a normal compost heap in your yard. But even if you're in an apartment, composting your compostable garbage is doable, and you can take care of about 1/3 of your waste stream with just things that are compostable. And of course, the old adage, reduce, reuse, recycle. Start with the reduce part, okay? At the point of purchase, go through the mental exercise. What is the fate of this item? What's going to happen to it when I'm done using it? Okay, do I need a 15th pair of shoes? Given that all of mine hurt and none of them, pass them down, pass them around. Find 10 things that you can definitely do without. I give this as a homework assignment to my class. They have to come in with a list. 10 things I definitely don't need. Air freshener, bathroom, toilet, glue making stuff. You start thinking about it. You can find 10 things you can do without. Plastic bags, okay? Anything that you use and throw away, anything that you use and end up putting in the cupboard for an indefinite, whoever knows how many years. Find a way to pass it on, or find a way to not buy it. Just start thinking through, at the point of purchase. How am I going to clean this? How often am I going to actually use it? What am I going to do with it? What is its fate when I'm done with it? And then you'll start having a more responsible pattern of consumption. And share the joy. These are my grandchildren and my daughter. And, these little kids are facing a very, very difficult world. And I feel bad sometimes at what our generation has left to not just their children, but their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. And I think if you begin to put into perspective the message that Rachel Carson came forward with so courageously 50 years ago, and think about the choices that we would have now if we had taken seriously what it was that she was advising 50 years ago, we would have many fewer complications in our lives. And, you know, one thing that I did take away from 10 years in Alaska was that the people there, and I spent a good bit of time in the Alaska Native Policy Institute, which shared a building with me at the UAA, they do actually think out 7 generations. They name people back 7 generations, and they think about the implications for their whole community, their whole way of life, their whole system. And so things are not done in the same kind of arbitrary way when you make policies. You have to think through what is it that you're leaving to those who come after. And we have to thank Rachel Carson, because she was way ahead of her time, way ahead of her time. And she paid dearly for that in terms of, you know, the assault that was landed on her in the last years of her life because of what she had the courage to say. So, if you want more information about what we do and who we are, you can find me at Chatham. And I thank you for your attention and welcome your questions.
Where was that high school you went to? I never heard of it.
Parnassus, it doesn't exist anymore.
It was up in that area?
Yeah, it's in Lower Borough. It was
Oh,
4
I never
miles.
heard of it, that's why.
It was 4 miles from her
That was
house.
in New Jersey.
And what other,
It was 4 miles. I think it's in Toronto now, where Toronto is, so she would
you
walk.
said we're second or third, Peterson City, I thought they improved over the years. in schools.
We've improved tremendously
I thought
much,
it was
but we
extremely
still, and it's the fine particulate level, ozone level, and fine particulates. The Allegheny County Health Department is doing an investigation of air toxics regulations now, and hopefully
I
we'll.
mean, I saw pictures of the Tory Bridge, you can't even see it, it's like
Oh, yeah,
dark, it's new.
yeah, the street lamps were in all day, yeah,
Is that the Coke Works next to
Yes.
Homestead?
yes, that's
Oh,
our.
they-
Quite a distance from Homestead.
Yeah, it's clear.
Yes.
Is one of the 4, you mentioned there were 4
Yeah, what are the-
coal burning plants in southwestern Pennsylvania that were on the sort of very worst list. I know one of them is near Indiana, PA. But I wondered, are any of them in Springdale? I mean,
I
I know
don't think the
Springdale has.
Reliant power plant
problems.
that's in Springdale just put in last summer an upgraded pollution abatement system, so I think they went off of that list at that point. But they only put it
Yeah.
in 2010,
Oh, I remember that.
and it has been
story.
running since 1970 something, so. Yes,
Just get back to 112, there would be incandescent light bulbs produced.
there is a rule, you can go to the US Department of Energy site and see the requirements, yes. It was part of the National Energy Act of 2009. Yes.
Did Carson ever see any of the positive aspects of insecticides, like such as like?
She died a year after her book. She died in 1964, so most of the major changes that took place took a little longer than that to actually take place, yeah. She did see that her book had had a huge effect because it sold large numbers. And she was invited to speak everywhere. She was given awards. She was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom, but after she died, she was given all kinds of accolades. But it was close to the end of her life by that time. Yes.
Sorry, this lady.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The 1960s, we were lucky that she was doing this around that time because we were waking up to a lot of other problems in the 1960s, especially the fair employment practices and things like that. And certainly the environment became a part of things
That's
that
right.
we citizens became aware of too.
That's true.
And it was just right for her to have that, right at that time. We are lucky. We really are.
You had a question. You had a question.
I sometimes get to thinking that all of this is a sum zero situation. Because at the time that Rachel Carson was doing most of her work, you had a lesser number of different types of insecticides and herbicides and things of this sort. So there's been an exponential increase in those, as we've also had a population increase. And then when you look at the recent agricultural department's poisoning of birds, and we know that that dead zone in the Gulf is much larger than it really is described, and they hardly even brought it up when BP
Right,
was
they
having,
didn't.
it was out so far on the margins, you really had to have your magnifying glass to read it. And then when you land from another country in the aircraft, they often spray you with a sweet smelling poison, which they tell you will hurt you, but the stewardesses or whatever, you attendants that go down the aisles and they spray that fog down through there, and you're trapped, you can't get off the plane.
No,
unless
they
you-
did that, but they didn't,
Well,
they
they
still
do, I've
do
been
that?
sprayed many times. I mean,
Really?
Oh, they do it on the Hawaii, but they walk down and they make a little small talk and they look joyful, and they spray sweet smelling poison on you, and so,
One more reason why I don't fly.
no, but getting back to the sum zero thing, one time, and I only throw this in tangentially, I bought well over 100 and some copies of Silent Spring, gave them out to some students. They got them for free. But the point is I still look back at all this with some knowledge from different areas and wonder if we're any further ahead. We can't seem to get the politicians of Pennsylvania to realize that they're putting everything from airplane fuels and all kinds of things down these cracking wells that they're doing out here for the gas. New York is a little smarter, but they're under challenge now. Out in the Midwest, they grow sunflower seeds for oil and for bird seed. Then they poison the red-winged blackbirds to keep them from eating the seeds. So I get to wondering again whether we're back to zero.
Systems thinking. Everything's connected to everything else.
Well, I know
If we
that.
could just get that concept across to the politicians, we'd all be a lot farther ahead.
Yeah, but if you talk to these people that put that barge up down here at the point that tell you about the fish, and I know more about those fish than they do, and they'll tell you, oh, well, these are bottom feeders, so you shouldn't eat those, but you can eat the others because they're higher in the water. Well, if you want to spell BS in large 8-foot letters, well, go down and talk to those guys.
Well, it's a very complex issue, yes.
So right now I'm taking a class that's history, United States history and policy since Silent Spring. And we're just now exploring the criticisms that were raised of Carson and all the reviews and people who just said her facts just aren't right and brought up other sides of things. And I read Silent Spring and I thought it was, I just kind of believed it all, and then I'm seeing these criticisms and it's like, well, I'm now kind of, what do I believe? And I'm wondering what your take on it is. I mean, obviously there's, some of the criticisms were a little, we were just talking about one that was written that says that there were actually more birds and there was, everything was better because of this, and that seems a little bit far off. But then there's some that just kind of poke holes in the studies or say that she twisted studies. And I don't know what you think about all that.
Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring for the purpose of putting forward an argument. So it was a rhetorical writing, okay? It was not a scientific writing, but it was documented. And you can look at the back of Silent Spring, literally 52 pages, and look at the citations that she drew from. She also interviewed and had reviewed each of those chapters by people who were expert in that field, and I've talked to some of those people, E.O. Wilson included, because she wrote about fire ants. He was the fire ant expert at the time at Harvard, and she sent her chapter to him. That level of care in not misrepresenting what was going on. There are a lot of people who have used Rachel Carson as the excuse to account for a lot of other things. And if you look at the malaria story as an example of something that is taken as the final word, okay? You're treating malaria, you spray with DDT and you don't have malaria. Not true. You can look at places where malaria has been addressed in different ways, and the only places that malaria has been successfully suppressed are areas where you improve the public sanitation, the drainage and water, and the habitation. If you are living in houses with no windows, doors, or screens, if you're sleeping under bedding that doesn't have any way to protect you from what is invading you in the way of insects, they say, oh, we'll impregnate the mosquito nets with DDT, and then the insects will not, they learn not to land, okay? They learn not to land. We'll put it in the paint, okay? They learn not to land within 2 years. But you know who puts it in your mouth? The little kids who crawl on the floor. Their hands are in their mouth. They suck on everything. They get their bedding in their mouth. So you end up contaminating the children. And this kind of thing, again, a lot of the criticisms that are put at Rachel Carson are coming from one dimension. They're coming from a small perspective. They have an agenda. She was a systems thinker, and she looked at how things fit together in an integrated way over the entire ecosystem that people inhabit. And it was a revolutionary allegation that people are animals, number one. They're animals that live in a habitat, and they are poisoning their own habitat. And when they do that, the poisons you put into your biosphere will come back and affect you. That was what she was saying. She was not giving a specific scientific answer to a scientific question. Now, Tyrone Hayes is. So if you want to look at his work, it's published in peer-reviewed journals. It has been checked and tested and verified and validated. That is a scientific undertaking. If you look at the work of Dr. Birnbaum, she has done human epidemiology studies on many of these things in, comparative locations. And those are scientific studies. She was writing a rhetorical piece, trying desperately to get the attention on something with an eye to generating precaution. Yes.
How do the Pittsburgh rivers rate as far as pollution goes compared to other cities? Are we the top 10 polluted or the bottom 10?
I
or-
don't know that number. If you wanted to know that, go to the U.S. Geological Survey and look at their comparative data. I have not looked at that.
It used to be worse. When we moved here, I remember every night about 10 o'clock, this horrible smell would arise in the air, and I said, why did we move here?
Well, I know in 1970, when I was a graduate student, the pH of the river was 3 sometimes. It had a lot of phenol in it.
I've read that in studies done that in Western Europe and the United States actually measured the testosterone level in men and sperm count, and they're going down very significantly.
1% per year.
If we pass, so it's already affecting us even though we're not aware of it.
Now, nobody can prove what was doing it, but the facts are, you can go to the Centers for Disease Control and look at fertility studies and data tracking that, and you can find that verified, yes.
But look on the bright side, we're correcting our own problem. Fewer of us.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Marcos.
Thank you.
I just want to say that for the past few years, Teresa Heinz has had a women's
Health and Environment
Health and
Conference,
Environment Conference, which addresses about some of the things. It's a day-long conference